Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christiaan.
And today we're going to take a special look at something very timely because it just ended at the end of 2019 and we're just going into 2020. Tom King's run on Batman.
Needs no introduction, really, but this does need to be prefaced a bit because it does come in a weird transitionary era for DC Comics and comics as a whole. This came out right after they negated all the New 52.
Well, negated is a little, especially for Batman, isn't as true as some other characters.
And, so this came out right at the beginning of Rebirth. This was, the launch title, Rebirth, and was the flagship for the entire, line launch until 2020.
You know, you had in the New 52 Scott Snyder's run, which is really well liked, but I think if there is a criticism to wage against it is he would sometimes kind of dawdle in between big plot points. Now, you can't go against it because it has Court of Owls, it has Death of the Family, a lot of really big stories that work really well, but there's a lot of dead space in there in 52 issues. So it's interesting for them to pick who they do pick, Tom King, at this point. You know, King's work was really well liked on Grayson, Omega Men, but he's not the superstar that even Snyder almost was when they started the New 52. He hadn't quite gotten as much recognition.
Well, Snyder had the Black Mirror and Gates of Gotham, which were already considered, classic Batman stories. And King had, he had very weird interpretations. His Grayson run is famous for turning Dick Grayson into just a super spy, making it almost like a James Bond title. And a lot of his issues were very based on, politics. And that comes from his background, which we'll get into in a second. And it was interesting to pick him for a Batman run because Batman's usually, an apolitical character. What Tom King does with it is kind of interesting.
Tom King starts off his career at Marvel and DC as an intern, working pretty heavy with Chris Claremont, from my understanding. But then, after 9/11, joins the CIA and works in those operations for 7 years. After World War II, you had a lot of writers who had been in combat, writers who had worked with military stuff, and then you get a little spike after Vietnam, too, where you have a few writers who are, have first-hand knowledge. But King, especially being CIA, has this weird point of view that works really well, and he ends up using that in The Sheriff of Babylon. But it's interesting to see how he does go back to superheroes, pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting because comic writers, especially now, they're always comic writers. They very, very rarely stray off that path. But Tom King has that path of, being an operative before that. And he brings a lot of that into Batman itself. And I think that's kind of what makes his run stand out a lot.
What's funny, too, though, is in, literature, it's not terribly uncommon for people to transition from, military or intelligence positions to writing. We're just not really used to it in comics.
Yeah,
I guess is really what it is.
Because it lends itself well to, penny novels, kind of like Tom Clancy stuff and things like that. But not so much in comic books. And I think that's just because of the nature of American comic books.
Or I guess, you could say, it doesn't lend itself, but then that was kind of proven wrong.
Yeah.
So King gets announced as writer on Batman. Personally, at that point, I hadn't really read much of his work. In fact, I was basing most of my opinion off of Grayson and Omega Men, which I didn't even know the CIA background at that point. I had no idea about any of that, and I wasn't reading his Vertigo stuff either.
I was a big Tom King fan before he started his Batman run, actually.
Really?
I was reading Omega Man, I read Sheriff of Babylon, I read Vision. Those are some of the best books of, the 2010s. Especially the Visions, you haven't read it, it's a very weird, dark run. And I love it. It's interesting that you didn't know about him beforehand because it was a very obscure pick and it kind of speaks to what they were trying to do with the Rebirth movement.
It's funny. I did read Omega Men because I'll read any Omega Men book. And I read Grayson, but in my head, because I knew Tim Seeley, who he was co-writing with, a little better, I associated it more with Seeley. But then I realized, this guy was also on Grayson, so that's good. Yeah. That changes very quickly. Once King's on Batman, he becomes sort of the superstar writer. like almost immediately. And he does a ton of projects at DC. We'll touch on a couple of them as we move through Batman. But, you know, we're really going to focus on his Batman run here because of how it's constructed and how intricate it kind of became by the end.
I think that has a lot to do with the nature of how they released this, because when Rebirth started, they said it's going to be 2 comics every month. It's going to be bi-weekly. It's not going to be once a month. And I think that affects a lot of how he structured this, because, like, you're getting 2 issues a month, so you can kind of pace it a lot more, like, tightly, and then there's a lot more ways you have to, like, fill issues out, because you're doing like 26 pages every 2 weeks. So I don't want to say there's a lot of filler in it, but there's a lot of like intentionally dragging things out.
I might disagree with that a little bit with the terminology of dragging it out. I think we're going to address the same structural things as we go. But, you know, the other thing to look at that too is with the bi-week schedule, he's knocking out about 7 years of comics in like half that time.
It's a lot.
So that's interesting in itself. Well, you know what? Let's just start where we start with this. First arc is I Am Gotham. That's going to run from issues 1 through 6 effectively. I think technically they say 5th is the end, but 6 kind of picks up a lot of those storylines.
And really, it runs to the entire series.
Right, and that's something I think we're going to touch on again and again, is there is no small arc in this. The entire thing is one big arc. I think we probably should note this now. If you haven't read the run, this is not the podcast to listen to right now.
No, it is on the DCU app if you want to catch up. Not all of it. I think it goes up to about 70. But if you want to catch up, please do, because we will be spoiling basically the entire run.
This is the other thing I wanted to say, too, is this also isn't going to be a summary. Like, don't listen to this if you're looking to find out what happened in the story and, you know, like, you're going to use it as your resource to pick up Batman now. We're not going to do that either. This is going to be very much about what Tom King built over those issues. I think you probably could listen to this without reading it. It certainly would be better than trying to listen to it as a substitute for reading it.
Yeah.
Use your discretion. If you think you want to know what the big deal is before you read it, yeah, listen to this. If not, we'll see you on the next one. So as we were saying, the first sort of mini arc that we get in this is a story called I Am Gotham. King introduces a pair of characters, Gotham Girl and Gotham, who are distinctly superpowered.
Yeah, they're pretty much an analogy for Superman, really. He used that to contrast Batman a lot with Superman without directly using Superman, because I think King's very good about using history that's very recent and playing off of that. And kind of this, he didn't want to make Batman and Superman enemies, which is what most writers tend to do. He kind of makes it that Batman's on friendly terms with a lot of people, and I think Gotham Girl and Gotham become very interesting substitutes for Batman being the non-superpowered superhero and contrast him against the superpowered superheroes.
I also think it's the first step in this sort of building an argument of what Batman is. There's definitely an element of that throughout the entire run where, you know, Batman is this character who really shouldn't be as high up on the totem pole as he is if you think about the power levels of his buddies. And I think Gotham and Gotham Girl are a comment on that it's about, you know, the ethics of Batman and how he acts within Gotham that make him special. That it's almost a comment on those superpower characters that they're not special unless they have something behind them. And there's a lot of elements to Gotham and Gotham Girl about how their powers are sort of manufactured. I think that's the comment he's trying to make. And when I first read it, I didn't really get that. 100%, I just kind of was like, all right, this is well written. It's weird, but I'll give it a shot.
A lot of this doesn't unfold into many issues later. I do also think, like, the way I Am Gotham starts out is more about, like, Batman training these superheroes, too. It's interesting that he doesn't really use any of the Robins. He kind of builds his own cast out. And you kind of see that in the beginning with I Am Gotham. You see him kind of training Gotham Girl and Gotham themselves to take over the city. And it's interesting to see a Batman that encounters a lot of his weaknesses, because he says a lot of the time, like, the very first issue of this run starts with Batman gliding a plane, basically between a bunch of towers, and it's a really cool, like, action sequence. He was basically going to die because he has to crash a jet into a river, and if he does that, he'll fly off and, you know, physics will kill him. But he gets saved by Gotham. Gotham, I guess, man, it's going to be kind of...
He's just Gotham.
Yeah.
He doesn't last the whole time, so... Gotham Girl becomes substantially more important as it goes.
But he kind of, like, tutors them. You think for a while he's going to become, like, the new Robin, but that's not the case.
Which is funny, because that's another thing that kind of pops up again later. This is followed by Night of the Monster Men, which is a crossover with Nightwing. Steve Orlando also co-writing on this, issues 7 and 8. Certainly flows well into it. There's no real issue with it. And King does bump into a few other crossovers as we go, and they're always really good about making things work.
It's mainly used to set up the 3 big arcs right after this, which is I Am Suicide, Rooftops, and I Am Bane, which is kind of the core of the King run. Yeah,
it's really where you get it. I Am Suicide starts to delve into the darker side of Batman, this idea of Batman, not being able to be completely sane if he's doing this. Now, whether that's the answer at the end of all this or not is the question, but it's certainly an admission that there is an aspect of Batman that's fatalistic, and is also the first time you start bringing Bane back into the picture, which is going to be a big thing, arguably, is the entire run. This was really divisive. It still is. I'm huge on I Am Suicide. I think it's one of the coolest Batman stories I've ever read. If you take that, 5-issue arc and just look at it, it's one of my favorites. A lot of people were turned off at this point.
I can kind of see why they were turned off. For me, I don't have any problems with what King does, thematically. I just don't like how he does a lot of the dialogue throughout his run, which we'll get into, gets towards the end. Because he has a very specific way of writing that I don't think really fits well with Batman.
See, I would disagree with that. And you know what? I think we can kind of talk about it even here, because this is where you do first really see it. And it's something that's going to carry through all of these issues that we're going to talk about. There is a very distinct internal monologue throughout all of this. I like it because when you look at the writing for a lot of characters now, and this is a broad criticism, and it's not specifically targeting any book or any writer. Too often, I think, they get out of the character's head because the stories get so big. I think this grounds everything, and it also tells you that this book about Batman is about Batman. That this isn't about the villains. The villains are there, and they have to act, and they have to, screw things up for Batman. Mm-hmm. But the book itself is about Batman, which I don't think is 100% true in the Snyder run. I think he goes back and forth. He has really good character moments with Batman, and then sometimes he just gets completely lost in everything else.
I think Snyder's very good at physically challenging Batman, and King was very good about emotionally challenging Batman, and this is kind of where you see it. Intellectually and thematically, I have no problems with what King does. I Am Suicide, it basically introduces Batman as being suicidal, ever since his parents died as a kid. And that's kind of the big introduction that King runs with throughout his entire run. He also brings Catwoman more into the fold of Batman's personal life. And he uses Bane as a way to contrast Batman of what he could have become. And I think what he does with Bane is really interesting. And this is basically the core of all of that.
Right, you start that in I Am Suicide. I would disagree. I think by the end of I Am Suicide, you realize that the motivation for Batman to act the way he does goes beyond that sort of kind of self-hate. And that's where he's growing. And I think a lot of that is a comment on past Batman stories, too, where King is trying desperately to take decades and decades of how the character is written, sometimes in very contradictory manners, and bring it back down to, okay, who is this guy? Why does he do this? And at the end of the day, why is it right? Which I think you don't totally get your answer to until the end of the run. But you start to get the idea even in here that that's where it's going. I Am Suicide followed up by Rooftops, which is your first romantic thing that they do with Catwoman and Batman, which becomes something very important.
Kind of where the dialogue really fails for me, because Batman and Catwoman have very little chemistry in the pages with each other, because it's very repetitious. There's just no flair or chemistry, and that's kind of been a problem with this Batman throughout the entire run. It's it's a very distant Batman. A Batman that's kind of purposely trying to distance himself from everything.
See, I kind of disagree with that, because I feel like that's sort of his point, that this crux of Batman, there is this element of distance to everything and everyone, but she's pulling him back in, which eventually pays off. We don't have to get into it now, but I disagree. I think that's part of the point, that he is like this analytical brain running 24/7, and you feel that when you like get this internal monologue from him. I like it. I think that's what Batman sounds like in my head. Like, he's not Superman. Superman's going to be like a little more like emotional, a little more like tied in.
Yeah, because he can afford to do that. Batman can't. Batman has to be 24/7. How do I stop crime? And that's kind of like the whole point of it, is that he has a war on crime, and King brings in his CIA background to really make it feel like a war. Like, there's a lot of like Batman just plotting stuff. Where you see that a lot in I Am Suicide. Like, you spend like a good 2 issues Batman planning to break into Bane's hideout to get Psycho Pirate. Psycho Pirate being a kind of obscure DC villain that becomes very big in this run because he manipulates emotions. What King does with Psycho Pirate is that Bane uses him like a drug to like make himself get happy chemicals, which is, I guess, a very literal interpretation of what drugs do.
There's also a little bit of nod to something that maybe is not happening the way it was intended to as we're going through this, where Psycho Pirate was also the only character to have remembered the Crisis originally. So there's definitely a little tie there. As we move forward, we go to I Am Bane.
This is where I got into the run, because this is a very cool set of issues of like Bane just beating up every single Batman villain.
It's also very tied into the idea of Bane that's presented in Nightfall originally. Nightfall, it was a big event and had a lot of different writers' input on what was going on. But if you go back and read those issues, this Bane exists there. Like, this idea of, like, this almost Batman character is totally there. And I think this is King sort of making a statement that if, this story still survived, Nightfall is still something people talk about. Bane should be a bigger threat than he has been since then. And I think that that's kind of the point of I Am Bane, is to kind of bring him back to the forefront. Bane, would appear after Nightfall and had a couple of, like, bigger stories. But once he was defeated, I think a lot of writers approached it as, oh, he's not what he said he was. King's Bane is just someone who failed once and is coming back again to try to do it. And I think that works a lot better for the character as he was presented originally anyway. Like, Bane would not have stopped entirely.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of Bane got lost through time because they've had all these ridiculous, like, movie interpretations of him, from, like, Batman and Robin to The Dark Knight Rises, that kind of, like, give these very odd interpretations of Bane. But King does a very good job of, like, making him a threat and making him an incredibly smart intellectual threat to Batman, and, like, kind of points out that he was the only one to break the Batman. Even though Bane fails at the end of this, I think he makes a great case to make him a bigger villain than he should be.
You said it better than I did. He's the villain he should be at the end of I Am Bane. And what's cool is, a few years later now, he still is. After that, you get the Button, which crosses over with the Flash. That's your tie-in to Doomsday Clock.
Which just ended, and it was introduced in issue 21.
Yeah. There are plans at DC that clearly didn't go as they were supposed to. You can read some rumors about what that was, but we're not going to get too heavily into it. But that does bring open the sort of multiverse idea again, and the soon-to-be exceptionally important Flashpoint Batman.
Flashpoint Batman, for people that either don't remember or haven't read it, Flashpoint Batman is Bruce Wayne's dad that becomes Batman. It's basically an alternate reality where instead of Thomas and Martha Wayne getting shot, it's Bruce Wayne and Martha Wayne that gets shot.
Oh, and, no.
Did I get it wrong?
Yeah, it is Bruce Wayne who gets shot, and then Martha Wayne becomes the Joker.
Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah, I forgot about that one detail. But Thomas Wayne, the core of it is that he becomes the Batman. I forgot Martha Wayne becomes the Joker because that was such like a one-panel thing.
Yeah, well, it's only the original story was like only 2 issues, so it's tight, but it was cool. And there had been a lot of interest in the character. I think that's largely because of the design and the fact that he's a Batman carrying a gun, killing people. And for some reason, people like any time that any character turns into the Punisher, you're going to sell some issues.
Yes, spiky shoulder pads too.
Yeah, he's very aggressive looking. He's very mean. He's got a red motif going on. After that, we get The Brave and the Mold, which is a really cool one-shot Swamp Thing Batman story. Does eventually lead King to write the Swamp Thing Winter Special, which is also great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every epilogue is a prelude. Issue 24 we're up to now. And this really ends the first sort of chunk of King's run with the engagement of Batman and Catwoman.
The infamous engagement, some would say.
I don't think it's infamous. I don't know what... I think ultimately, we'll get to the end, but I think ultimately it's fine. After this, we go to the flashback story of the War of Jokes and Riddles, a struggle between the Joker and the Riddler for control of Gotham that involves Kite Man.
A lot of Kite Man.
Hell yeah. I think anyone who's writing a big title book like this has to eventually get back to the big villains. I think it's sort of irresponsible not to, and I think if you're not using the characters that have made the story popular, you run the risk of kind of producing something that no one's interested in, and also you're not really acknowledging what people are coming for the book for. I think not doing it immediately and not being super heavy-handed with it is the way to go. That worked in Morrison's New X-Men, where you found out Magneto was the bad guy the whole time, but you didn't know that. Like, that kind of storytelling works. I think dropping this flashback into the middle here works both in the respect that you get King working with Joker and Riddler, you get him making Kite Man into something totally different, and you also get sort of a nice little, like, period to, like, stop thinking so hard after Batman and Catwoman are engaged.
I also think, like, this is a year into the run at this point. You always see Scott Snyder did this too. Like, usually when they get to the Joker, they kind of run out of ideas because there's only so much you can do, and everyone wants to make that big Joker story. They want to make another Killing Joke too, and that's usually where writers seem to run out of steam for a bit, and they just kind of use this to go in autopilot mode for a little bit.
I would disagree in this respect because I think that's almost what King is acknowledging by doing the story this way, is that it's very much a story about what Gotham was like before the present Gotham. And I think that's his way of kind of commenting, like, you know, like, I'm not going to be able to do anything revolutionary with the Joker, but I can make you remember why he's such a big threat. And I think that works. Not the last time Joker will appear. Following the War of Jokes and Riddles, which almost acts as this interlude, we go right back into the engaged Batman and Catwoman with the rules of engagement.
Like the TV show.
Yeah, or like war. But except this time it's about them being engaged. This we can kind of like squish into almost its own little category because we get the rules of engagement, we get the Super Friends arc, which is briefly interrupted by the very dark origin of Bruce Wayne. This is almost a little chunk of sort of Batman having to deal with his exes and friends. I think King is like ingenious in this. Rules of Engagement primarily focuses around Talia, which of course would be sort of the biggest ex for Batman.
Kind of the only ex in a lot of ways.
Well, there are other ones that just didn't really do anything. Then Super Friends is about his relationship with Superman, Lois Lane, Wonder Woman primarily. Wonder Woman, who there were some romantic entanglements in the past too, which doesn't get acknowledged as much as it used to in the 90s, but...
Yeah, I'm glad they didn't really build a giant love triangle out of this. He kind of just acknowledges Catwoman's... If Bruce Wayne has to date somebody, it's kind of only Catwoman, which is what I appreciate a lot about this run.
We get through that sort of pre-wedding talking to all my friends storyline with Everyone Loves Ivy. A little bit of setup for Heroes in Crisis here. Heroes in Crisis not necessarily having a huge impact on Batman, but Batman ends up having a huge impact on Heroes in Crisis. So you have that's one of your first moves towards that. Bride or Burglar leads into The Gift, which is another big one for Heroes in Crisis. This is Booster Gold attempting to make Batman's life better and creating an alternate universe that is just horrific. Super, super dark. And I think maybe the first time up to, 45 issues. The Gift starts on issue 45, where King really gets away from Batman being the center of it. Like, Booster Gold is very much takes over that book.
And throughout all this, you don't really see any of the Robins either, which is really interesting.
Yeah, you do see them in I Am Bane.
A little bit.
Like, you think they might be dead at one point.
Yeah, but it doesn't really last because
But I think your point is valid here because there's what ends up coming up. of course, is we get to the return of the Joker and the Best Man. Joker finding out about the wedding. There's a little convolution with, like, the Bruce Wayne and Batman, who would know what, when, and how do people know this. But it is out there, I guess, in the DCU that Batman is getting married. So the Joker, rife with jealousy, comes in. It's a cool story. 2 issues. Not something it's almost like you know how much King is concentrating on it by how many issues it is. If it's not 5 issues, it's basically a one-shot.
Yeah, and that's just the nature of how they're releasing this, too. It allows them to spend a lot of time exploring this stuff, for better or for worse. I do like that he kind of acknowledges that, like, a lot of Batman stories kind of parody the fact that Joker is quote-unquote in love with Batman, and Batman's quote-unquote in love with the Joker. I do like that he takes it kind of, like, the logical extreme of this.
Like we said, like, King doesn't feel the need to get too deep into the Joker at any point here, I don't think. He's not the villain for the run. The villain for the run is Bane. And that's going to come up even harsher on issue 50, The Wedding, which is not a wedding.
No, this pissed a lot of people off.
It did piss a lot of people off, but I think you'd have to be a touch naive to expect things to work out as straightforward as they're presented.
Especially in comics, wedding issues are usually, like, always crashed.
And I remember hearing this, too, that a lot of people were mad because I guess some news outlets had reported that they were definitely getting married.
Yeah.
And so people bought the issue who don't read comics and were just angry that they didn't get married. Which to me is really funny because it's like, okay, so you cared enough about the story that you cared that a character was getting married, but you didn't care enough about the story to read any of it.
It's because wedding issues they never go right, ever. Like, there's no comic wedding issue that goes right.
And I remember over at Marvel, they were mocking them with the X-Men Gold one, where Kitty Pryde and Colossus were supposed to get married, and they don't get married, but then Rogue and Gambit got married, so Marvel, like, acted like they were, like, you know, hot shit. It was like, we had an actual wedding.
But now all that's kind of up in continuity anyway. It's like...
Yeah, I think they're still married. Who knows? What's Gambit doing? Gambit's on Excalibur, I think?
Yeah. He's on Excalibur. They're definitely fucking. We get to talk about it a lot.
That's what Gambit's there
for. That's a whole
Gambit's
side
job.
plot. Anyway, back to Batman.
Now magic, too. It's getting... So essentially, the wedding is foiled by the emotional turmoil planted by Bane.
Now that you say emotional turmoil, Psycho Pirate makes a lot more sense to me, because it's very much literally just emotional turmoil with the character.
You know, we have a Bane, like we said, who failed at physically destroying Batman. So now he's going to tear him apart any way he can. And that sort of becomes what this second... It's not really a half because it is supposed to be 100 issues. It ends up being legitimately 88 issues because of the 3 annuals that run within here. It was supposed to be a 100-issue run, which was announced pretty early on. We're going to get that later in a Batman Catwoman book. But we do get to pretty much what's the half point of the story at 50, where we begin to reveal the intricacy of Bane's plot. That Bane's plot has gone far beyond this, and he's trying to, like, emotionally cripple Batman. Which is when Nightwing comes back in. Which is funny, because you're talking about how the Robins were not a huge part of this, and I think that's probably what he was doing. He was intentionally holding back on a lot of that. Now, they do appear. Like, there are points where the different Robins and assorted other sidekicks are around, but your real first big chunk where you have a character come back is this run where Nightwing is kind of working as Robin again with Batman, because Batman's so beaten up after what happened at the wedding.
It is refreshing to see Nightwing come back into this, even briefly. Just because, like, he hasn't really worked together all that much. The only time they kind of talk to each other is in the Monster Men crossover. And, like, I do like how King writes Nightwing, too. He's a lot more jovial and everything.
You're always the temptation to go kind of dark with any, like, Bat Family character. But there has always been that sort of idea that Dick Grayson was kind of having fun. And I think a lot of the good adaptations get that. And a lot of the better issues of Batman understand that he's not Bruce. He's never going to be. He's always going to have, like, that sort of lighter, like, aura to him. You know, the argument in the Black Mirror is maybe if you become Batman, you start to lose that a little bit. But he's not Batman here, and he's trying to help Batman kind of get back on his feet. And I also think this is, if I'm correct, this is also the point where Batman goes back to the traditional costume.
Some people make big deals about the costume changes, but, like, they're very minor changes.
And I would say in this run, it's almost irrelevant. But I think it is around this point that does happen, if you want to find out. So, Nightwing's around to cheer up Batman, and then he gets shot in the head during the Beasts of Burden storyline, featuring cult favorite KG Beast.
When characters die in this run, it's so hard for me to kind of believe it's happening. And I think
Nightwing's not dead. He gets brain damage and he doesn't remember who he is, and he becomes Rick Grayson.
Yeah.
Who is very, very similar to Dick Grayson and Batman Forever, which is part of the reason that I still like that run, even though it's kind of middling. But rumor is he's going to be back to being regular Dick Grayson soon. So we'll see what happens.
Jesus.
He's still Rick Grayson right now. But they don't address that too much in Batman. It's the point in Beast of Burden is he's taken out of action. Yeah. And then Batman has to hunt down KG Beast.
And I think they do it, and they're trying to do it in a purposely shocking way, which King does a lot. But when you read it, you go, yeah, that's not sticking.
Yeah, not forever, but it has stuck for a pretty decent amount of time. Let's be honest.
Some stuff that gets stuck there.
So we go from that to the Tyrant Wing. Batman teams up with the Penguin. Not a bad story.
That was fun. I do always just like the Penguin as a character. He's just such a weird character, and I think there's a lot to actually mine from him that writers don't take advantage of, just because they want to do a big Joker story.
Yeah. And then we go into Nightmares, which is probably the most high-concept thing in the entire book. Nightmares runs from 81 to 89. There's a 2-issue interruption where Joshua Williamson kind of crosses over again with Flash to do a little cleanup from Heroes in Crisis. Yeah. It's slightly mistimed, I guess, if you're looking for continuity as far as that goes. But it is still fitting kind of the themes laid out by King, because it's working with Heroes in Crisis, which was his other project through a lot of this.
Yeah, a lot of Heroes in Crisis ties a lot thematically into the King Batman run, because it's all about just how heroes deal with depression and post-traumatic stress and things like that. And that really shines in this set of issues from 61 to 69.
It's an interesting thing, and Williamson also, extremely competent writer, yeah. So you don't ever feel
Extremely confident. That feels like a backhanded
compliment. Oh, I'm going to say it's not a backhanded compliment, and I will say that, just so if you thought it was a backhanded compliment, I'm saying that he's a very good writer. He's someone who's going to understand... Yeah, how to just continue the structure and the themes and everything and not make it feel like a total left turn. I would say that Williamson's run on Flash is one of the most underrated things to come out of Rebirth. People don't talk about it, and it's been consistent, and it's a book you can read from top to bottom with very little interruption, outside of these crossovers with Batman almost. He's a very good writer, and I think if there was anyone that I would have trusted in that position, it was him, and I thought it worked out well. Nightmares, as you're saying, real, psychological examination. It's a lot of hallucinations, Batman running into characters who aren't there, but is part of this journey back from what Bane has done to him, from what, Bane controlling Gotham has done to Batman.
And especially, him being without a Gotham, which is kind of rare to see. Scott Snyder was very good about pitting Gotham against Batman, but here we actually see Batman outside of Gotham, which is something you only really see in Justice League comics, and even then very rarely. And I think King does a good job of saying, despite everything that Gotham's did to him, Gotham is still his home.
From this point, 70 to 74 is technically the Fall and the Fallen, and then 75 to 85 is referred to as City of Bane. This is really where you get Batman building himself back up to come back, him reuniting with Catwoman, while the other Batman, Thomas Wayne Batman, is out there running amok under Bane's control.
Again, this is kind of the cap on the entire series. I don't know how much more Batman and Catwoman can capitalize on, because it feels like this last 2 arcs kind of tie up everything.
They really do. I think thematically this is your end, and I think this is probably why King didn't fight to hand over for what might be a smoother transition. We'll talk about what that transition might be, because I think he does get a lot done. We do get the big moment that I think a lot of this has been building to, which is the death of Alfred, because I think thematically what they're supposed to be doing here, there's always that idea of finally ending up, with your soulmate, and then that changes your relationship with your family. the almost literal destruction of his father again, along with the death of Alfred, who is effectively his father, is this chapter break for Batman. I think that's what he's been working towards this entire time, that for Batman to truly move on from all of the pain, which, I think even the way it's written, that you never forget about everything that's happened. I think the death of Alfred is supposed to be this break. It's supposed to be now Batman can move on to his life with Catwoman because his life is entirely different. And the other way around, that it is different because of his life with Catwoman.
I also think it's just, you can't really move on either because, you can't just forget what happened to you in the past in many ways. And, Alfred literally dying on Batman is, that's going to change his life forever. Thomas Wayne dying, too, is such, a big thing. Even though Batman wasn't close to him, he still symbolically was a lot.
And he still was his father, in a way.
In a weird way, yeah.
And I don't know if he's dead. I kind of reread it.
He could be around. I wouldn't be surprised if Thomas Wayne shows up.
He's definitely been, his back has been broken by Bane by the end of the run.
Yeah. But I do also want to point out that I am going all the way back to the first issue. The first issue starts with Alfred saying goodbye to Batman. Because Batman's I gotta crash the plane, I'm gonna die. And they have a very somber moment saying goodbye, I love you and everything. And the whole run ends with Batman saying goodbye to Alfred.
Yeah, and what I think is a kind of a cool thing they do is that Alfred is dead before Batman does. There's also something we were talking about before, how they didn't really use a lot of the Bat family. That changes in City of Bane. City of Bane is really about sort of the whole rise of all of the Bat characters to take care of this issue. It also ends with a not at all hidden idea of the fact that his past and his family is what's motivating Batman. And that's the move he needs to get past this sort of emotional distress that Bane is playing off of. Bane is really trying to bring up ghosts to take out Batman. And now Batman realizes that he can move forward without forgetting what's happened.
King's saying that Batman's family is what keeps him grounded is not all that radical, but I think what is radical about it is him kind of admitting that Batman's not a happy person. And even when he has a fan around, he's not necessarily happy, but he has something to fight for, besides just cold hard revenge, which is what's motivated him for most of this.
I don't think anything King brings up is a new idea.
No.
I think the sort of triumph of this run is his ability to take all of it and make it work together. Yeah. His relationship with Superman, the fact that this guy who's kind of his best friend is this almost opposite being. His relationship with his sidekicks, his relationship with his own mental state. These are all things that have been questioned, that have been the focus of one story. King goes into the head of Batman to get through one arc, but that arc lasts 85 issues because that's how complicated the character is.
Because so many times, even with Gotham Girl, there's several conversations I have with each other about why are you here? Batman doesn't really have an answer for any of it.
And it's something we didn't even address, that Gotham Girl at one point ends up basically Flashpoint Batman's Robin. There's a redemption arc there about how if you go back to what you believe, you can always get to where you're supposed to be. There's a lot going on with the side characters in relation to Batman's journey, but it's always Batman's journey.
He's always the center of every single issue, which, you would think would happen in a Batman comic, but that's not always the case because a lot of writers like to explore the side characters. King doesn't really do that. He kind of uses the side characters to explore Batman.
Right. I would say yes, and I think he does the same with Catwoman. But what I think is cool about their relationship in this, and something that King recently has talked about, because there has been this sort of criticism that it's too much of a love story.
We'll get into it in a second, but I don't think the romance is very good in this at all.
I would disagree because it's about focus on... He loses focus because ultimately they both are convinced by Bane and his cohort that they can't have a relationship because it's not possible. It's not that they don't want it. And it's their journey a little bit back to that too, where it's, no, they can't tell us what to do. We're in charge of our own lives.
Yeah, but the only one that's really, convinced by that, I mean, I know Catwoman gets convinced by it, but, I feel only Batman would actually be convinced by that, because, Catwoman spent years kind of chasing after Batman and, having sex with Batman and all this stuff. And Batman's always been the one to say, no, we can't do this.
Or yes. But I think that's interesting. I think that's part of the reason, though, too, that he gets into that weird, like, where he starts playing with continuity, where it's like, what was the real, like, first meeting? What was all this? Because I think that's almost a comment on it, too, that it's more about where they've ended up because of all this information than it is about that actual past. Because that actual past doesn't exist, which is like this weird, like super like meta thing. But he does it. Like he does comment on that. You can't act like that by throwing like that continuity into question constantly, that he's not commenting on the fact that this idea of their past is sort of amorphous in itself.
That's kind of, I didn't really think of it because a lot of this is very heady and like not in a Morrison heady way where like Morrison will point out like this continuity is wrong and this is why it's wrong. King's more like, well, they both had different perspectives on it.
Right, and that different perspective, like, you want to get even deeper into it, you could even argue that's a comment on the readers, that it doesn't matter so much exactly what happened, as long as we get to the point that we're supposed to. And then he makes this almost secondary comment on it of, not only is it important that we're where we're supposed to be, but that we can move forward with the story, which some people kind of disagree with in comics. They don't really ever want to move anything forward.
That's a very subsect of comic fans, too. Interpretation is also interesting because this does feel like a interpretation of Batman, not the interpretation. Like, Morrison and Snyder kind of presented like, this is the Batman. Not like, King's very much is like, this is my Batman.
Morrison's Batman is very much this idea of the man who can think of anything and can stop anything. Snyder's Batman is very much the idea of the Sentinel, like the character who is there to stop all this craziness in Gotham, and Snyder's runs more about the craziness of Gotham than it is about Batman.
He builds him up more mythically, and like, Morrison's more about like trying to figure out all the interpretations fitting together.
And then it's almost like King's Batman in that sense is, all right, this is a real person. How would all of this play into how they perceive the world? And then what would be the actual biggest threat to them? And he frames Bane as the anti-Batman, the way that he was kind of implied to be, but never really was, and now he is.
A lot of people say, oh, like, Batman's kind of like a superpower Sherlock or something. And, like, in many ways, if we're going with that interpretation, King makes Bane the Moriarty. Because Bane wants to be the Napoleon of crime. He wants to kind of stop crime by taking over all crime. Batman just wants to stop all crime.
And there's definitely a comment in there, too, about the Joker that, like, traditionally we see the Joker as the antithesis of Batman, but in a lot of ways the Joker's just chaotic, and because of that interferes with everything Batman is doing because he's focused on Batman. Where he's not so much the equal as he is this element that you can't control. And so he can always pop up. He can always come back. Bane's actions have to be a little more serious. They have to be more deliberate. They have to be big.
I guess this is going into the other ways, because a lot of this is Bane trying to manipulate Batman emotionally. And it's interesting to see him try to do it with Psycho-Pirate, but Psycho-Pirate's like, he can't manipulate emotionally Batman because he's just too focused. Which I guess is kind of like implying he's a bit of a sociopath in a way. But a lot of this is about Batman trying to fix other people too, weirdly enough. Especially using Psycho-Pirate, while Bane's focused on fixing himself. And Batman's not focused on fixing himself.
That's an interesting comment too, because you talk about, that, especially I think in recent years, there's been a lot of that discussion of like sociological and psychological views of these characters. Even you start to get in like the 80s, but I think even like the last 20 years, I think just because of how much media there is, you see a lot of stuff like online, you see books written about it. I think there's almost a secondary comment on that too, where King's almost saying at the end of the run that it doesn't matter a person may or may not have going on in their head. It's about ultimately what they do and how they move everyone forward with them. I think that's part of the point of I Am Suicide. There's certainly that fatalistic element to Batman, but that's not him. Everyone is complicated. Everyone's going to have like these pieces of them that are going to be contradictory, but it's what comes out at the end that matters, and that's Batman. In this case.
I think a lot of it too is like Batman saying like, I'm broken, like I'm not happy, I'm not a happy person, but that's okay.
Right.
And Bane kind of like, I'm not a happy person, how do I fix this? Like, if I'm not happy, no one can be happy. And that's not how Batman operates. And I think a lot of that is why they contrast a lot. And you see that a lot in I Am Bane. Like, Bane goes a lot into his past, and Batman goes a lot into his past in those, like, arcs. And you really do see the difference between them. Like, Bane's, like, physically breaking people, while, like, Batman does kind of try to help them in a lot of ways.
And it's interesting you said it that way, too, because it plays off of, the really old idea of good is open, like, good is trying to see what everything is, and evil is restrictive. Like, evil is going to stop you from doing things. And that is that relationship with, like, Bane's view of power to Batman's view of power. And it is a view of power. Batman is trying to get the upper hand. Which is always that contradiction in any hero, is that they are pursuing power. It's just you have to have enough faith in them, and in this case, they have to have enough faith in themselves to act correctly.
I'm surprised King didn't really talk about, like, the weird, I guess fascist is the only word I can really think of right now, where, like, Batman's kind of a controlling character. And King's usually talked about politics a lot, and it's kind of interesting to see him stray away from that and just focus just on emotions and trauma.
I think it's interesting you bring that up. I think it's intentional that he doesn't do that, because I think that's part of the point he's making, is that Batman, at his core, is never that, even if he may appear so.
Well, I was thinking because of, like, the Frank Miller run, like, that's the central idea in the Frank Miller Batman.
Right, but that, like, the Dark Knight stuff, even Frank Miller himself from day one has said this isn't the Batman. It's a Batman. It's, like, an idea of where this can go. And you don't really see it in year one. Like, year one kind of serves as, like, a universal origin story for Batman. And you certainly do see that idea when you get to, like, Dark Knight. But I think a lot of writers, even if they appreciate that, and I can say this for myself, I 100% appreciate the Miller Batman stuff. Like, I've read all of it. I even like Dark Knight 2 more now after Dark Knight 3 came out, because I think it kind of grounded it a little better. But that isn't Batman. Like, it's not the Batman. And I think King's Batman is a lot closer to how I see the Batman, where, like, that tendency is always going to be beat back. That tendency is never going to come to fruition, because that's not who he is.
And I think that's kind of why he's friends with Superman in a lot of ways, too, because Superman's all about holding back all that power and then stopping himself from trying to take control of everything. Despite us talking about so much Batman, we haven't talked much about Catwoman, despite her being such a central part of all of this.
Well, I think that plays into what we were saying, is this story is very much about Batman, and every time you think that it's going to go off on a big tangent, with the exception of The Gift, which is really a story about Booster Gold, it's Batman's relationship to Catwoman that's being focused on. And you're in Batman's head. And I think that's even more interesting, compounded with the fact that King himself has admitted that a lot of this is coming out of his relationship with his wife, like how much he loves her. But it's how much he loves her. It's him thinking about her. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be a perspective from Catwoman. It's just he's writing a book called Batman that's about Batman, and it's going to be about Batman's perspective.
Seeing Catwoman's perspective, I think, would have, like, helped it a little bit, too. I think that's kind of why the romance falls flat for me, because it's usually all about, like, the people pining for each other, but here we only get the pining on one end, and him second-guessing himself all the time about it. And that's really what the romance is in this Batman run with Catwoman, is Batman kind of being like, well, I shouldn't. I could, but I shouldn't.
I'll give you that, and I think you're right. If you wanted it to be a more romantic story, I think that's absolutely the way to go. I think this is about Batman and how Batman sees the world and what he's doing, and it's not as romantic of a story because you're not looking at it from that perspective. You're looking at it from the other perspective, which maybe is closed off, but I think that's the point.
Yeah, no, I agree that's the point too, because this is about Batman being a closed-off person and him ultimately opening up after all this trauma by giving him more trauma.
And furthermore, I think kind of the beauty of that is it doesn't get in the way of anything. A lot of times a big story like this would interrupt other things going on with other characters. Because it's so focused 99% of the time, it allows Batman to show up in other stories, and you don't need to get into his head into that because it's not this. It allows other characters to go do whatever they want them to do. It's that sort of pure, focused comic book storytelling that we so often lose to crossovers now. Even though this has little crossovers, but they're like responsible crossovers. They're like 2 issues, and then you're out.
They usually happen in the beginning too, and like King does a smart job about like not putting a lot into those crossovers. Like the Night of the Monster Man crossover is just Batman punching monsters for like 2 issues.
And it's fun. It's fine. It's So, I mean, I think we've pretty well gotten through like what we think has been done. let's talk a little bit about where we think this is going and maybe what some of the original plans were and these last 12 issues that we've yet to see anything of. I don't think they've even been solicited, if I'm correct.
No, I have not seen solicitations, at least up until March, because I actually had to go through the solicitations from my comic book store. My idea is that he might try to do some time travel stories because that's been something he's touched on a lot through this run.
That's really interesting because that's something that doesn't even occur to me, but you're not wrong.
Because, yeah, he plays a lot with Thomas Wayne, and he does, especially in the later half of the run, there's a lot of, like, alternate histories he touches upon and how catastrophic they would be for Batman. And I think that might be something that there's going to be touches of time travel here and there. About, like, Catwoman and Batman exploring, like, how their relationship could go. I don't really imagine a lot of, like, actual fighting or anything. At least not on the scale of City of Bane, or I Am Bane, or I Am Suicide. Just because Batman and Catwoman fighting villains is not what the appeal of their relationship is. It's more about just, like, a detective falling in love with a criminal. That's really, like, the core of it.
I'm going to go a little more, like, less intellectual, quite frankly. I don't know how to put it. You know, we talked about this really briefly, that originally this was supposed to be a run of 100 issues. We got 88 because we had the 3 annuals, so presumably this run would have ended on what would have been, what would that be, issue 97? Let's bring some of the rumors that have been going around recently. Not a rumor. James Tynion IV took over Batman on issue 86. That's already out as we record this. Introduced like a pretty like standard Batman story. Nothing too remarkable as of yet. We're going to an issue 100. The rumor for a very long time now has been that at issue 100 or after issue 100, Luke Fox is going to take over as Batman, initiating this 5th generation concept that supposedly is going to play off the timeline being established as a hard timeline again, and thus making our sort of main cast older. Meaning Batman would be like in his mid-40s, early 50s or something. So an older character, so a younger character would now be taking up the mantle. This supposedly has kind of been the plan since like Rebirth. If that was the case, that means that King would have been building to some kind of thing like that. He would have known that there was going to be a changeover, and it would have made sense for there to be like 100 issues in between there to get there. If we're going in that direction, and there is some stuff to back it up, the 5th generation, a little bit of a spoiler for something else here, is name dropped in Doomsday Clock at the end, and they show art that looks like familiar characters who might not be the same people. If this is true, and King knew this, and knew that he was ending an era of Batman, which he certainly did with the death of Alfred and now Batman with Catwoman, which is not terribly dissimilar to Batman Incorporated's original concept, does that mean that King's last few issues of Batman are going to be like a half-active Batman, like with Catwoman going around the world?
Yeah, I can imagine that. I can imagine it Batman retiring and then tying into it Batman Beyond, because in Batman Beyond we do get like a 50-year-old, 60-year-old Bruce Wayne kind of mentoring a new generation.
Yeah, and I think that's a little messy too right now if we are going to be doing that timeline, like, as the rumor is, because we do have a Batman Beyond book going on. I mean, we can always bring in alternate timelines, I'm sure, but you know, are we moving towards the end of Bruce Wayne as Batman if we just had the end of, like, the Alfred in the Mansion era? Like, was Wayne Manor now, like, done and Bruce Wayne won't be Batman anymore? Not terribly dissimilar from Dark Knight Rises either.
It is the most logical way to end it. I would be interested if they actually do it, because I think it would be a mistake to make Luke Fox the next Batman.
But this is the thing, and like this is, you know, not an insult to the character or any of the creative behind it outside of this thought. We just did a podcast sitting here talking about Batman for what? I don't even know how long it'll be when it's all said and done, but we don't have any attachment to Luke Fox.
No, he shows up once in like the entire run. He's such a weird, like, I don't disagree with Lucian Fox's nephew being involved.
I thought it was his son. I don't even know.
But he's so distant from, like, the core, like, Batman. It's like, okay, Lucian Fox, Batman's, like, inventor. And then his inventor's son.
Who's now like, taking on... That is one thing that they did establish in Tynion's run, is that Lucius Fox has become kind of the Alfred
at least a little bit they touch upon it. I don't know if that will actually maintain its way throughout all of it.
But the point is, like, how do we get past this idea of we're still on this double week schedule? Issue 100 is objectively not that far away. Could you build a story within that time? Maybe. I don't know. Are we moving to Bruce Wayne transitioning out? Because that would work thematically with what we've already done from the Tom King side. From the Bruce Wayne side, it works. Does it work on a non-Bruce Wayne side if we bring someone else in?
I just don't want Luke Fox to be Batman, because you have, like, Damian Wayne, Nightwing, you have all these other characters that he has so much more history with. And, like, I even think, like, in the Maxi series, he might introduce, like, the son of Catwoman and Batman, because that's been a recurring thing.
Especially if we're playing with time. What if we're going to jump 5 years or something? We don't know where this is going. We know something is happening.
But there's so many other characters you could use besides Luke Fox, and I don't think Luke Fox has the pedigree to really, like, be Batman. Now, we could be wrong. You know, maybe in, like, 50 issues, he'll be fine as a Batman. But it's just such a weird character to bankroll all this on.
Right, and you're talking about the premier character in the company. Regardless of the history of Superman. Superman is, you know, the prototype. Superman's wildly important. Batman's your top character. Are you risking something you don't need to risk? And are they? Do we even know? Because none of this is official. I mean, this is something we should say again, like reiterate at this point, that these are all rumors, but they're strong rumors, and they're rumors that are popping up in the places that usually end up right.
Right, yeah.
You know, this isn't state secrets here. Like, this stuff gets out. I'm really interested to see where this goes, because I feel like they definitely didn't end Bruce Wayne's arc in issue 85. You could do it in 12 more issues. And I think what they have done is they've set up things for change. How extreme is this change? How much of it did King plot out?
Well, what do you think they would have to wrap up? Because, like, so much of it has been wrapped up.
I think what we just discussed, I think it would be Batman and Catwoman move on to whatever their new life is. Whether that is them as Batman and Catwoman or not. I think if this aging thing is coming into play, which sounds like it's real because it's popping up a lot, and we have, you know, moving into middle-aged Batman and Catwoman who have just decided to stay together, I think that's a logical point for Batman to stop being Batman. And like you said, have kids, do whatever ends up coming next. It's a weird place to be because it definitely could be an ending for Bruce Wayne, or it definitely could not be. It definitely could just be the next step. I think the industry is still looking for direction. I think the last couple of years have been a lot better than the few years before that.
Yeah, they still have a year and a half to really figure this all out. I mean, realistically, it's more like a year to figure it all out. But the deadline's coming up pretty fast. Right.
There needs to be a direction for everyone. And as I said in the bold prediction last time, Marvel's direction seems to be trying to bring everything together. I can't imagine DC's not looking at trying to figure out exactly what's going on either. If there weren't plans that were thrown out at this point about what continuity was supposed to be, I'd be shocked. It seems like it's obvious that whatever the intention at the beginning of Rebirth was is not the end game now. But how much did they change? What was the intention? It's all very interesting considering how tied this Batman run was to all of the concepts coming out of Rebirth, including the time travel, including all the like multiverse stuff. It's there. What's the comment that's being made now?
It feels like if DC was saying with Rebirth, we're going to start to age all the characters up once we get these arcs done. I think that has a realistic basis in the themes, because a lot of those runs at first were all about time and like how time has affected these characters over these years. Like you look at Wonder Woman, Flash, Batman, Superman, all of them are about time and who they've influenced, and kind of building up like who comes up in the shadow of these superheroes, because you had that Chinese Superman for a while.
He's still around, and he's actually shows up in Batman, which is funny.
But now you have like the young Justice running around, and you have people from the Young Justice show showing up.
You both have Young Justice. You have the Teen Titans,
Princess Amethyst. You have all these younger heroes popping up now, and I think that is definitely a direction they want to go in. But they actually have to commit to it, because right now it feels like them saying, "We're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it." For years.
It does, and you're right about that. It has felt like that. if you've been reading, like big portions of DC's line, it's felt like 5 or 6 times that it was about to explode into something huge, and then it just didn't happen.
Like, Doomsday Clock ended, and nothing's really changed. And they built that up as, like, the big event.
And they've changed their tune on it over time, quite frankly. Initially, it was very much implied that it was supposed to be a big continuity event, and now they kind of pulled back on this, that this is somewhere sort of off in the multiverse, and it's reflecting changes, but it's not the changes. There's a lot of little things that looked like there was this huge plan for where this was all going. And King seems to have come closest to what he intended to do, but even within that run, you can see that there's maybe this bigger picture that isn't happening yet.
That does definitely feel like the case, especially towards the end, because it does feel like you wanted to make a Batman that was getting older and a bit slower and getting surprised by some of his enemies. Do you have any criticisms about the run, if any?
While I disagree with you on ever being really, like, turned off by the way that the dialogue and things were going, I think there were points where you didn't need as much of one story as they did. I think a couple of the sort of like 2 issues could have been 1 issues. That's just now looking back at it. I would say that the quality of the writing at the time, it didn't bother me, which maybe is more important, which maybe is why I don't focus on it. Because when I went back even to look at how this is broken up, I was shocked how many little chunks there were, because to me it had a good flow in my head.
Yeah, I had to binge this because I kind of bowed out of DC once Rebirth happened, and I didn't really follow the run. And I binged most of it on the DCU app. And I think that's kind of why I noticed the dialogue so much, because, like, overall, like, the comics flowed really well together. But, like, kind of hearing Batman say the same things over and over again, it got very repetitive very quickly.
Yeah, you weren't even getting as much of a break as I was with 2 weeks in between.
No.
I think that's actually something to be praised, too, is I always felt like King left things in spots where you wanted to read the next issue, which is a dying art, unfortunately. A lot of writers, even good writers, are having a hard time with that in recent years.
And I think it's just because they don't know what's going to change by next week.
That's true, too. With all the, it's a very different environment to work in, with the huge corporations looming over everything, and, never knowing where your, like, editorial mandates are going to come from. Because that seems like less of a problem at DC. It just seems like DC has a lot of turmoil with where they're going.
It seems a lot that DC's kind of like, we want to commit, but we're waiting for a higher up to say yes. So for now, just spin your wheels a bit. Like, we're not going to tell you to change anything, but, like, just don't commit super hard to it.
Which is kind of the opposite of what King does here.
Yeah.
To be frank. King very, like, that's, we talked about this at the beginning of this podcast too, that, it's very clear once you get through all of this that he knew where it was going in issue 1.
He had so much freedom, and it's a testament to his planning to see that, like, all of this flowed so well together, even though it was slow at times.
Yeah.
That, like, if you read, like, 20 issues all in a row, there's no point you're sitting there going, like, man, I wish they cut this issue, or I wish they cut that. The only thing is, like, well, I wish they could shave a couple pages off here and there.
Right.
There's nothing that's, like, they could have just thrown this entire issue out.
Which I think is one of the nice distinctions from this run from Snyder's. And this isn't to criticize Snyder too harshly, because I did read that entire run too. Mm-hmm. There are definitely pieces of that run that you don't need for Snyder.
Yeah.
Like, there are things you just don't need to go over. His big moments are huge and they work really well, which is what kept him going. But you don't get anything, like, distinctly forgettable in the King run. In Snyder's run, like, people forgot already that, like, Jim Gordon was Batman. For, like,
I was going to say Mr. Bloom.
Oh, Mr. Bloom, too. Yeah, there's the whole Mr. Bloom thing. But, like, these are, like, the things that, like, King's Run avoids by never feeling it necessary to kind of go in those directions and staying super focused on Batman.
The only last thing I want to say, the humor's good in it, too.
Yes, very good.
It's a bit awkward at first because it does just kind of come in randomly, but once you get used to it, it's funny.
Yeah, and Kite Man.
Yeah, Kite Man. It was like I was reading I Am Gotham and Kite Man shows up and it's like, what's going on? And then after a while I was like, oh, it's a joke character because I thought because he's like punching Kite Man after like Joker or something. Like, no, he punches Kite Man after Two-Face. So it's like, wait, is he saying Kite Man's an actual threat?
And then he becomes so brutally and distinctly not a joke in War of Jokes and Riddles that it's like, oh, I don't even know what's happening anymore. It's great. But I think we've really covered what we wanted to cover today. Yeah. as we always say, follow us, like us. What do they... I hate it. They say smash that like button.
That's only on YouTube.
Yeah, on YouTube, smash that like button. I don't know. You could just click it.
Subscribe, hit the bell.
Subscribe.
Smash that bell.
Subscribe on any of the numerous major podcast platforms we are on. That always helps. If you have the opportunity to give us a rating, give us the highest rating.
Yeah, 5 stars or 10 stars.
Yeah, whatever rating, whatever they'll allow you to as the highest rating, do that. That does help quite a bit. You can check us out on pretty much all relevant social media and Vero. And I think that brings us to the end today. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And we'll see you soon.